Thank you, Helen, for that introduction. I am Martyn Waites. This is the history of crime fiction. As Helen said, I'm a crime novelist, predominantly. Excuse me. So, okay, the format is going to be, I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes on the history of crime fiction. Please feel free to ask any questions during that time, and then we'll go to questions for about 15 minutes at the end. And yeah, please make them good ones, because I'm very, very willing to answer them. Okay. Crime fiction. So what makes a crime story? One of the things that a lot of people get very upset about now is saying that crime stories have got too violent. Crime stories are all about violence towards women. There's an unnatural structure about it, you know, with the DA saying you've got 24 hours to solve this, Kowalski, or you're off the case, you know, and people think this is a new thing. It's not. The very first crime story was in the 1001 Nights, the Arabian Nights, narrated by Scheherazade, and it was called The Three Apples. It involved a woman's body being found dismembered in a trunk, and the vizier, the local vizier, was given 3 days to solve the crime or he would be murdered. So that kind of set the template for crime stories to come from that. However, what we would now recognize as a crime story, the first one that actually could be called recognizably a crime story, is Murders in the Rue Morgue by Edgar Allan Poe, 1841. It has his detective, Auguste Dupin, solving a series of crimes in Paris's Rue Morgue. These crimes, obviously, are being committed by an orangutan, running along the rooftops, breaking into people's houses, stealing stuff. And there's a big fight between Dupin and the orangutan on the rooftops. Strangely enough, this caught the public imagination, and people wanted more stories of crime fiction, of solving crime. And so that's what happened after that. He wrote 2 more stories, The Mystery of Marie Roget and The Purloined Letter, that Edgar Allan Poe wrote. The Mystery of Marie Roget is based on a true story, and it is it's the first example of a true life crime being used in crime fiction. Now, the next big development, I mean, as I say, I'm talking now about US and UK just for the purposes of this talk. There are other stories from around the world, but we're talking about English language ones here. The next big development was Wilkie Collins' novel Moonstone in 1868. This introduced Sergeant Cuff, who was kind of a late 19th century Columbo, basically, who shuffles about, doesn't get much respect from the rest of the characters. He's of a different social class, but he is the detective who eventually solves the problem of the Moonstone. It's a brilliant book, absolutely brilliant. It's one of the great detective novels ever written. Dickens' Bleak House, which was written just before that, 1852 to 53, also has Sergeant Bucket, a big long section with Sergeant Bucket in. And as you probably know, Wilkie Collins and Dickens were big mates with each other. They often would write together, and they even collaborated on plays together. So, you know, there is a kind of overlap. That's the other thing that I should say about this. There are going to be big overlaps in timeframes, in genre. Nothing's going to kind of come to a clear-cut stop and then move to something else. There are overlaps happening the whole time. The success of The Moonstone and Bleak House led to a spate of crime fiction stories, detective stories mainly. The most famous one from about this time is obviously Sherlock Holmes. Everybody knows Sherlock Holmes. And Sherlock Holmes is different things to different people. If people want to think about gaslit London streets, fog rolling in, pea super, the time of the Ripper, then that's the way that you can think of it. If people want to think about Dartmoor, something gothic, something almost folk horror-ish with the Hound of the Baskervilles, you've got that as well. You also have the fascinating thing I find about Sherlock Holmes is that he is an arch rationalist. He was based on Dr. Edward Bell in Edinburgh, who Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote the stories, worked for. And he would then solve the crimes through forensics, through rationalization. The interesting thing is that Conan Doyle himself was the complete opposite of this. He was a big believer in the Cottingley Fairies, which was two girls with little cardboard cutouts of women dressed as fairies, which they were then photographed with, and it was proved to be a massive hoax. He believed that. He believed in spiritualism. And he... But the thing that he became most famous for, he also wrote the Professor Challenger stories, where Professor Challenger would find dinosaurs and sea creatures and things like that. But the thing he became famous for was Sherlock Holmes. He became so famous for Sherlock Holmes that he got sick of the character and tried to kill him off in his last bout. When, on the final solution, when Holmes and his arch enemy, Moriarty, went over the Reichenbach Falls together. People were so despondent by him doing this that they were walking around London with black armbands on. This was how much the death of Sherlock Holmes affected people. Now, he had to bring him back. There was such a public outcry that Holmes had to be brought back again. And it was kind of a sort of, reveal, haha, Watson, I'm still alive, I return. And, it was and he kind of kept going after that. It was very unrealistic, but, it was kind of the market forces, really. Now, Sherlock Holmes also, if I was to say to you, to name me a detective who has a problem with women, problems being social, a drug problem, listens to music constantly, there are plenty you could come up with, plenty of contemporary ones, but that is actually a description of Sherlock Holmes. There's some other great stories around at the same time, writers. Arthur Morrison was particularly good. He had a corrupt detective who would only solve crimes if there was something in it for him. He also had a working class detective who would solve crimes amongst the upper to middle classes, and they would always look down on him and he would always solve them. There was it's well worth exploring the wealth of Victorian and Edwardian fiction that's also out there. Now, the interesting thing is that, as I said, there's still an overlap from him, which we'll come to. The Valley of Fear was written in 1915. So that was one of the latest novels. And the Casebook of Sherlock Holmes, the final collection of short stories, came out in 1927, when there was still a movement going on completely away from Holmes by that time. Because in the States, the next big development that had started in the States was the hard-boiled school of crime fiction. And the most famous proponent of that was, at the start anyway, Dashiell Hammett. Now, Dashiell Hammett is a fascinating character within his own right. He's an ex-private detective, worked for the Pinkerton Agency. So his character was a private detective who worked for a company not unlike the Pinkerton Agency. Now, the reason that he was, or created him to be a private detective, was because in the late 19th century, the police were, certainly in the States, were lazy, they were corrupt, they were incompetent. They, interestingly enough, that it was only until the Hays Code came in Hollywood in the 1930s, the mid-1930s, where they were told to actually show the police in a positive light. And this is why up until then, in the 20s, the private detective was the one who would solve crimes in the majority of fiction, because nobody would read the police, because nobody believed it. The police were always the dumb foils to the clever private eye. Hammett created the hard-boiled school. Oh, certainly one of the very first exemplars of it. Carol John Daly was another one. Raoul Whitfield was another one. Now, these stories came about through Black Mask magazine. This was a pulp fiction magazine. These were the kind of continuation of the Victorian ones, the Victorian penny dreadfuls. And they were called pulp fiction. They were pulp magazines because they were printed on very cheap pulp paper. That was why. And the most famous one was Black Mask for crime fiction. There was Thrilling Detective, Spicy Detective was another one. And a lot of the writers for these would write on other pulp magazines. And these magazines might have a kind of novel or novella in and about half a dozen short stories each month. And there would also be pulp magazines on other themes at the same time. So you would get romance pulps, you would get Western pulps, you would get pirate pulps or First World War air race pulps, something like that. Everything, you know. Or you get the Doc Savage stories or the Shadow pulps. They would all be there at the same time. A lot of the same writers wrote under pseudonyms for a lot of the different pulps. So, you know, you could be doing a romance short story or in a Western in the same week, then a hard-boiled crime novel. But really what happened with Dashiell Hammett and with what happened with Black Mask is that the hard-boiled style, this kind of short sentences, these staccato bursts of literature, these sentences that were really, really sharp and tight, they came about mainly because of the editor of Black Mask, Joe Shaw. Cap was his nickname, Cap Joe Shaw. And he paid by the cent, a cent a word. And anything that looked like writing, he would cut it out. So the good writers like Hammett learned to do what Elmore Leonard a few years later called iceberg writing, which was really to put as much as possible within as few words as possible, so that you had a whole layer of meaning underneath. It was very Hemingway-esque, and it created a new kind of fiction, which was kind of the opposite of what had gone before with the Sherlock Holmes and the Edwardian and Victorian type of fiction that tended towards the more flowery prose. And this kind of brought crime fiction to life, certainly in the States. The interesting thing is a lot of it is a question of context as well. And if I can just show you this. The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, a fantastic book, Arthur Conan Doyle, there it is, that's my copy of it. Short stories in this are brilliant, I absolutely love them. By the time he came to be writing Valley of Fear, which was published in 1915, Dashiell Hammett was writing in America. And this, the publisher Hard Case Crime, run by Charles Arday, a few years ago decided to try and rejacket a Sherlock Holmes novel as what would have been a pulp fiction novel, and came up with that. A.C. Doyle, The Valley of Fear. And what does it say there? Inspired by a true story. They all answered to the Body Master, and a screaming woman scantily clad on the cover. This concerns a Pinkerton detective. This is not a million miles away from a Dashiell Hammett novel. Sherlock Holmes was barely in it. So it's just a way of, you know, something within a short time scale, how perceptions could be altered by that. While America was getting to grips with hard-boiled fiction, which then became noir, but we'll get onto that in a while. In the UK, once Sherlock Holmes, once the Edwardian era had gone, it became known in time as the golden age of detective fiction. And the main author from the golden age of detective fiction was Agatha Christie. Now, I mean, I will nail my colours to the mast as I'm not a big fan of Agatha Christie in the way that she's revered by a lot of people. I think she's a great engineer. I think she can put together a story really well, really well. But the stories are puzzles. The characters are stock. The situations, the milieu, it's a country house, it's a vicarage, it's something like that. It's something, or it's a lot of upper middle class people on holiday on the Orient Express in the Caribbean, somewhere like that. And it's within an enclosed environment where someone is killed to provide a motive. Not a motive, sorry, a body. Someone is killed to provide a body. It seems an inconvenience. Nobody really seems to be upset about somebody being killed. It's only there to prove how clever the detective is. An old woman or a Belgian detective, usually with Agatha Christie. Her first novel was The Mysterious Affair at Styles, 1916, the year after Conan Doyle wrote or had published The Valley of Fear. And she kept going until her last novel, The Postern of Fate, in 1973. So she really kind of had the whole of the 20th century, but it is the 20s and 30s that she really has her golden age. The characters, as I say, were stock. They usually revolved around middle to upper class people. If working class people were there, they were usually as servants, and 10 to 1, they were in line for doing the killing. Now, whenever the murderer was revealed at the end, order would be restored, everything would go back to normal, it would be swept under the carpet, and God would be in his heaven, and the cricket would resume on the village cricket pitch. This was in direct opposition to what Hammett was writing about. Raymond Chandler, who I'll come to in a minute, said that he said that Dashiell Hammett gave murder back to the people who committed it for a reason. That he put it back into the back alleys, not into the drawing rooms. And murder was committed by people with whatever weapons there were to hand. And murder was committed by people who had something to gain from it, which is never normally the case in Christie. I mean, I'm not saying that she wasn't a great prose stylist. In fact, I think one of the reasons that she's endured is because her prose has nothing in it that anybody past the reading age of 12 would struggle with. It's why she's used as a teaching aid for people whose English is a second language, because they can conquer a novel, and it's easy. It's very, very easy reading. You can read one in a night. They're not complicated. They're not demanding. She also got into trouble with her American publisher for being anti-Semitic. A lot of her villains were Jews, and they were described in the most anti-Semitic terms possible. In fact, so much so that her American publisher asked her British publisher to take those descriptions out of her novels. Now, the Golden Age, it wasn't just her. It was interesting because the majority of Golden Age writers are the ones that have certainly endured from that period, would be mainly women. Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Josephine Tay, G.K. Chesterton, who wrote the Father Brown novels as well. He endured. E.C. Bentley. Ronald Knox came up with the 10 Commandments of detective fiction. And these sound ridiculous when you think of in the present day. The criminal must be someone mentioned in the early part of the story, but must not be anyone whose thoughts the reader has been allowed to follow. The stupid friend of the detective, the Watson, must not conceal any thoughts which pass through his mind. His intelligence must be slightly, but very slightly, below that of the average reader. Twin brothers and doubles generally must not appear unless we have been duly prepared for them. And not more than one secret passage or secret room is allowable. Now, I mean, this gives you the idea that the golden age of detective fiction, they were puzzles. That's all they were. They were nothing more. They were amusements. There was nothing in the way of great writing about them. And again, I think that we have to look towards the States for the next big leap forward, which came from Raymond Chandler. Now, Chandler took what Hammett had done and refined it. He created private eye fiction. His character was Philip Marlowe. And he said that he tried to create a knight errant, a person who wouldn't be in the situation that he was. He tried to create an idealized person who wouldn't be doing the job of a private detective, but would be there to try and right wrongs. And it was this famous essay that he wrote, "Down these mean streets a man must walk who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid." And this was Philip Marlowe. This was how he saw Philip Marlowe for himself. Interestingly enough, Chandler had a unique, he was English. He'd grown up in South London, in Streatham, and he attended Dulwich College at the same time as P.J. Wodehouse. And for years, I have tried to imagine Wodehouse and Chandler sitting in a class together, Bertie Wooster and Philip Marlowe sitting, learning together, just to try and get the image of a teenage Philip Marlowe and Bertie Wooster sitting together. Nobody else cares about this, I don't think, but I have passed many a happy afternoon thinking about this because I've clearly got too much time on my hands. But he did have this kind of sensibility. He was classically educated, and he brought this kind of classical education up into here, this very American, hard-boiled milieu. He didn't have the neat endings, and certainly Hammett didn't have the neat endings that Agatha Christie in the golden age of British detectives had. Yes, the killer would be found out, but there would be a lasting impact of that. Somebody would, there would be a loss, a sense of loss for it. It wouldn't just be all covered up again and swept under the carpet and everything would go on as normal. There would be an impact, a big impact. This idea of the private eye would then be developed. I mean, I'm getting a little bit ahead now. Would then be developed in the late 40s, 50s and 60s and through the 70s by Ross MacDonald. Ross MacDonald was the pen name for Kenneth Miller. He changed his name to Ross MacDonald. He changed his name to John MacDonald first, but there was another crime writer called John MacDonald, and he didn't want to be confused, so he changed his name to Ross MacDonald. His wife, Margaret Miller, was also a crime writer, so he didn't want to be called Miller either. So he became Ross MacDonald, and his main series of novels that he wrote, the Lou Archer novels, I think, I mean, this might be heresy. This might be heresy for a crime fiction, for a private eye reader. I think he's better than Hammett and Chandler. Lou Archer himself is barely there as a character. But what he does is he opens up family tragedies. He stands there and whatever has happened is then brought to the fore. He uses... MacDonald uses a kind of Greek or classical structure to these tragic stories that he tells. The first one was The Moving Target in 1949. It's still very much influenced by Chandler. He's just getting started. By the time of The Chill in 1964, I think that's probably his masterpiece. It's just one of the most perfect crime novels ever written. He used California. It's dark things happening within the sunshine of California. It's these families with secrets who are trying to keep them repressed. And as soon as they're let go, everything falls apart. And he uses that as a microcosm to then extrapolate on the American dream or the lack of it. He's brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. Also in America, or to start off with in America, one of the greatest novelists of the 20th century in terms of crime fiction was Chester Himes. Now, he was one of the first Black American writers, African American writers, to write crime fiction. He had to go to France and be published there first. He started with short stories in 1931. He had done a spell in Ohio Penitentiary for armed robbery. He wrote stories while he was in there. He wrote very socially conscious novels like If He Hollers, Let Him Go, which was published in 1945. He moved to France in the 50s, where he published in 1957 For the Love of Imabel, which became rejacketed as A Rage in Harlem, with these two detectives, Coffin Ed Johnson and Gravedigger Jones. Read Chester Himes. He's brilliant. He's the antithesis of this noble private eye going about his business. These are two detectives who the place bursts. It's alive with life and death. This idea of Harlem that he lives in. I really couldn't do justice to them. You have to read them yourselves. One of the main characters is the funeral director, because there are so many people dying that the funeral director, and it turns up in every novel. There's always scenes set in the funeral parlor. He is brilliant. He's absolutely brilliant. The energy that he has within his stories, phenomenal. Now, as I say, the golden age of fiction was happening in the UK at the same time. There were some attempts to utilize the American idea at the same time. In the 30s, we had James Curtis, who was very much a socially conscious working class writer, who wrote a novel in 1936, The Guilt Kid. In 37, he wrote There Ain't No Justice. In 1939, he wrote The Drive By Night, which was made into a great film by Emlyn Williams, I think. Great British crime novel, all about long-distance lorry drivers. Seek it out if you can. It's probably on YouTube. It's fantastic. Very much social realism, very much of the working class, very, very strongly left-wing, very Labour. Interestingly enough, James Curtis, once he got successful writing for films, moved to America, to LA, and ended up working for Walt Disney. So that was the rest of his life. He didn't really write much beyond that. Possibly the greatest noir fiction in mid-20th century from England is Patrick Hamilton's Hangover Square. It's a crime novel. It's about kind of a serial killer, somebody whose head goes wrong. He has blackouts, he kills. It's phenomenal. Don't be put off by the film with Led Krieger in it, which has nothing to do with the novel, apart from the same title. It is one of the standout crime fiction novels of the 20th century. It is one of the standout, certainly in my opinion, novels of the 20th century. Patrick Hamilton, it's genuine noir, it's classic fatalism. And this was a thread that was coming through a lot of crime fiction, this noir sensibility. And it was mainly taken from once the French had discovered film noir, which was the post-war American crime fiction. And a lot of the novels were then adapted for films, and this became a kind of two-way street. Chandler wrote for films, and a lot of other writers. William Faulkner wrote for films. William Faulkner contributed to the screenplay of Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep. There is an interesting story about that, because Howard Hawks directed that. Chandler wasn't a big one for plotting. Chandler would get a few of his short stories together and, as he said, cannibalize them, which means he would just chunk them together with Philip Marlowe being the one thread going through them. And these beautiful similes and metaphors that he would put in, which is what we remember Chandler for mainly now. He never cared about plotting. In The Big Sleep, the chauffeur for the Sternwood family is found dead. And it's never said in the novel who killed him. When Howard Hawks was making the film version of The Big Sleep, he phoned Chandler up and said, "We don't know who killed the chauffeur." Who killed the chauffeur? And Chandler said, "I have a clue. Does it matter?" And so nobody knows from the film, nobody knows from the novel. Answers on a postcard, please, if you know who killed the chauffeur. We can assume who killed the chauffeur, but nobody ever tells you. Nobody finds out, because Chandler never knew. He didn't care. That wasn't his point. Now, as I say, there was a very noir, a very fatalistic noir thread, which mainly didn't have happy endings. They had endings, they had emotionally satisfying endings, but they weren't happy. And especially in America, a lot of American women writers would write noir in antithesis to what was happening in Britain at the time. One of the writers, Elizabeth Sanksay Holding, was Chandler's favourite novelist. In 1947, she wrote a novel called The Blank Wall, which I would urge you to read because it is fantastic. There have been 2 film versions of it, and one by one starring Tilda Swinton. Neither film is anywhere near as good as the novel. It's fantastic. It's a great noir novel. Vera Casperay wrote Laura, which Otto Preminger made into his film. Dorothy B. Hughes wrote In a Lonely Place in the 40s. Dorothy B. Hughes is a fantastic writer as well. That was made into a film noir by Nicholas Ray, starring Humphrey Bogart and Gloria Grahame. In my completely biased opinion, that is possibly the best film noir of all time. It's just, it's so dark, it's so tortured, and it comes from her novel. She was a phenomenal writer. Now, the UK had a kind of writers working within that hardboiled style, as I've said, Patrick Hamilton and James Curtis. Peter Cheney would write, Don't Forget to Duck would be, and these were kind of pastiche novels. James Hadley Chase, No Orchids for Miss Blandish. These were very, very pastiche kind of novels as well. James Hadley Chase's real name was René Lodge Babazon Raymond, but he tried James Hadley Chase because he thought that sounded more like a crime writer. Now, in the post-war era, Britain was still more or less enthralled to this kind of golden age idea of detective fiction. But things were changing in America because after the war, the pulp magazines were failing. They were closing down because nobody wanted to read them anymore. They'd had their day. But what took their place was the paperback market. Now, a lot of the writers who would have written for the pulps went over to working in paperback fiction. And a lot of these books that came out at the time are now very prized. At the time, there were kind of things you could put into your back pocket and wander around with them and, read them wherever. Perfect portable books. These now are very sought after, a lot by the publishing houses from the time, like Lion and Gold Medal. This is to give you an idea of the kind of covers they had. There's David Goodis as Cassidy's Girl, Gold Medal there. Great covers, beautiful. Not going to tell you how much I paid for that. It's another one. What Ace would do would be to put two novels together. That's The Squeeze by Gil Brewer. Turn it over. Love Me to Death. And yes, if you can read upside down, I did pay $30 for that. And yes, I am proud. I don't care. So those were what came in the post-war era. And a lot of these writers would then, they're still being read now. Writers like Jim Thompson, like David Goodis, who I showed Cassidy's Girl there. Gil Brewer's another one. My favorite, Day Keane, is still read a lot. Because these writers, they would often write a book a month. Harry Whittington, we still don't know how many novels he wrote because he would write under pseudonyms. He would just sit down at the kitchen table and start bashing out novels. But the quality, considering the speed that these writers were working at, is even today phenomenal. They're not all brilliant, really not all brilliant. But the quality is so sustained from them doing that I have to take my hat off to them. I mean, I really do. That the way they could write something approaching literature within that short period of time. Jim Thompson, The Killer Inside Me, The Grifters. Donald Westlake wrote the screenplay for that. Stephen Frears directed it. I think he won an Oscar for the screenplay with Angelica Houston and John Cusack and Annette Bening when it was made. Fantastic film, fantastic novel. Killer Inside Me is another one. David Goodis is one of my favourites from that era. The Burglar, Cassidy's Girl, which I just showed you, The Moon of Gutter, Black Friday. Phenomenal. They weren't all men that were writing as well. Again, there were women writers. Dolores Hitchens being one of the most famous. Sleep with Slander and Sleep with Strangers are two of the best private eye novels that were written in that era, possibly ever. Really, really well worth reading. And at the same time, taking advantage of the paperback market were writers like Ed McBain, who wrote the 87th Precinct novels, which kept going till he died. And they started in the 50s, and they were really, they again, stick them in your back pocket, read them in a day or so. Fantastic entertainment. Margaret Miller, who I mentioned earlier, who was Ross MacDonald's wife, wrote possibly her most famous novel, Beast in View, was 1956. She is another writer who is, again, worth reading. It's because it isn't just the history of, a lot of the writers who are still remembered from this era are the white males, and it shouldn't be. A lot of the women writers from this era were really doing great. Of course, the one who I would say stands head and shoulders above all of the others from the post-war era would be Patricia Highsmith. For her first novel, Strangers on a Train, in 1950, was an instant success. Alfred Hitchcock made a film version of it. Raymond Chandler collaborated with him on the screenplay up to a point where they didn't get on, let's put it mildly. Chandler had also collaborated with Billy Wilder on Double Indemnity, the film version of James M. Cain's novel. The novel is incredibly different to the book, but all the dialogue in the film version is Chandler's. Chandler and Billy Wilder hated each other. Chandler and Hitchcock hated each other. You see a pattern emerging with Raymond Chandler when he was working with directors. Hitchcock's Strangers on a Train is a fantastic film. It's not better than the novel. Again, Patricia Highsmith's novel, phenomenal. Graham Greene called her the poet of apprehension. The series that she's most remembered for now is the Ripley series, started in 1955 with The Talented Mr. Ripley. Tom Ripley is this charming, amoral, bisexual psychopath who, as I said, charms his way. He kind of doesn't have a character of his own, so he takes on characters as it comes along, usually of people which he's murdered. You shouldn't be rooting for him. You do. She is such a good writer that you can't help but root for her all the way through. The most famous film adaptation of one of her Ripley novels is probably The Talented Mr. Ripley, that Anthony Minghella made with Matt Damon. Matt Damon, very convincing as a man with no character. I'm going to get angry for that. Right. Now, while this was happening, Patricia Highsmith could be a very unpleasant person in real life. She had a lot of angst from her childhood. Her mother had said that she tried to abort her by drinking turpentine. Not a happy family life, shall we say. And this was borne out in her fiction. She really, she said that she identified strongly with Tom Ripley. This was the reason why her readers could identify strongly with Tom Ripley. She bred snails. She carried them around in a bra. She was an interesting character, shall we say. Now, round about in this time, while this was going on in America, back in the UK, P.D. James was having her first novel published, Cover Her Face, in 1962, with her police detective, Adam Dalgliesh. I've always had a problem with Adam Dalgliesh because he's a published poet. And I'm not saying that police officers can't be published poets, but I'm just saying that not many of them are, in my opinion, and the police officers that I've met. You know, I've always, and he doesn't seem to age in the stories, which is, not a problem that a lot of writers have. She continued well through to the 80s, to the 90s. She was still writing. And she became it was almost like the lineage went from Agatha Christie, from the Golden Age, to P.D. James and to Ruth Rendell, who also wrote Inspector Wexford, From Doomed to Death, 1964, was her first novel. Inspector Wexford, now they've both been on TV, they both had huge careers. Dame Ruth Rendell was, she became a dame. She sat in the House of Lords at the end. I feel that they moved the storyline. They to me, that they had the same structure as the Golden Age writers had, but they moved on in terms of readability, in terms of turning it into proper writing rather than just a puzzle in literary forms. These were kind of the predominant writers in the UK until this 80s, late 80s revival in American crime fiction came along. James Lee Burke, James Crumley, James Elroy, other writers who weren't called James, Sarah Paretsky, Walter Mosley, Andrew Vachss. These writers, you could tell that they had this sense of engagement and involvement with the world around them, and they would. It was like almost like literary reportage. They would take the world as we see it, and then spit it back as fiction. I can't go on for too long about that because we're going to run out of time. But I know that at the same time over here, there seemed to be a groundswell of change happening within British crime fiction. A lot of writers seem to think we could do that. We could have that sense of engagement. We could take that and import that into the UK. I thought that at the time. I thought I'm going to have Newcastle because that's where I'm from. I'm going to do that. Ian Rankin did that at the same time with Inspector Rebus novels, which went on to be, if you want to look at Britain in the last 25, 30 years, read Ian Rankin. John Harvey, Inspector Resnick, did exactly the same thing. A lot of these were Scottish writers as well. Denise Mina, her second of last novel, The Long Drop, actually combines true life killer Peter Manuel with his last night before he God, I've written it and I've got a blank now, and I know she's watching this. Before he actually finding out the crimes that he committed. It's fantastic. It completely deserves all the awards and accolades that it got. And this is become the kind of crime fiction that we have now. If you want to look at where crime fiction is in this country now, possibly the best place to look is the shortlist for this year's Theakston Award. My Sister the Serial Killer, Owen Khan Braithwaite, The Chain, Adrian McKinty, Joe Country by Mick Herron, Worst Case Scenario, Helen Fitzgerald, Smoke and Ashes, Abir Mukherjee, The Last Man by Jane Harper. Jane Harper is Australian. Adrian McKinty is Irish. Helen Fitzgerald now lives in Scotland, but she's Australian as well. Abir Mukherjee, you see a much stronger and diverse representation of contemporary Britain from these writers, from British crime writers, than you tend to do in, let's say, with inverted commas, literary fiction as a whole. And this is kind of where we are now. Crime fiction is kind of an outlier. It takes the novel of society and the novel of a puzzle, shall we say, and combines it. You may not like the ending. The ending may not be pat. The ending may not put everything back to the way it was at the beginning and everything is lovely. It probably won't be. That's the great joy of it, in a way. It holds a mirror, a skewed mirror, up to the society that we're living in and asks you to look at it and to look at yourself. And that, I think, is why crime fiction is today the best, or certainly the most popular genre of fiction that we've got. Now, looking at the time, I'm going to have to look to see if anybody has put any questions down. Right. Oh, this is one. I don't know who says, don't you think Hammett and Chandler have a fair share of cliches between them? No, I don't. Because I think that they were writing at a time when these things weren't cliches. If they're cliches now, the idea of the private eye, it's because people are not very good at writing those. And they're doing really bad pastiches, mainly not so much of Hammett, who was a lot more hard-boiled, but of Chandler, because that's what we think of as private eye fiction. So many great writers mentioned this evening. If you could only read the work of one writer again, who would you choose and why? Oh God, I hate questions like these, because I think it matters who I would read. I know which writer I would read, and I haven't even mentioned him, barely mentioned him, mentioned him once. Graham Greene. He wrote a lot of thrillers. He also wrote a lot of other kinds of novels as well. But I would always go back to him again. I'd go back to Chandler. Chandler only wrote 7 novels, so there's not a lot to go on. I wouldn't want to have to pick one. Oh, we have the timeless great detectives like Sherlock set back in the day still being hugely popular. Do you think there will be a present day detective that will be as popular? I couldn't say. It's very difficult to say because a lot of the writing that it's not for me to say again what's going to be remembered in the future. It will be remembered, and it might not be the ones that we think is going to be remembered. At the moment, I would say Lee Child would be remembered. I would say I've mentioned Ian. He would be remembered. Val McDermid would. All right, another question here. How has lockdown impacted on your reading and writing? I've struggled to read a lot. I have been doing it, and it took me a while. And it took me a while to actually get going to write again. I have been, and I'm quite near the end of a novel that I'm working on. But I think it's as time's gone on, and I think a lot of people who've been struggling to write. Where do you see crime fiction going from here? From Amanda there. To be honest, I don't know. I mean, there are so many genres and subgenres of crime fiction that have been over the years. The cozy, the Agatha Christie type story, the hard-boiled, the Hammett, etc. story, the historical novel, which is still going strong, the locked room novel, where a body is found in a room that's locked from the inside, a little subgenre on its own. Police procedural, we've mentioned them a bit. Forensic, the kind of Patricia Cornwell books. A lot of them are kind of cozies, but with forensic detailing. More blood, less cake, as somebody once described them. Domestic suspense, with the books with girl in the title. I'm doing a whole genre down by that, but Gone Girl started off a whole trend in domestic suspense. So, that's kind of where it came from. Do you think the Agatha Christie style whodunit novels invites the reader to try and solve the crime? I loved that as a teenager. From Helen. Yes, absolutely. That was my point about them being puzzles, them being literary puzzles. And a lot of people do come to Agatha Christie as a teenager. And I think a lot of the residual love, she's still one of the best-selling authors in the world now. And I think a lot of that has to do with the nostalgia that people were getting from reading her as a teen. A lot of people would do Enid Blyton, I'm going back a few years, and then step up to Agatha Christie. And, because that was kind of the next step on. For me, I didn't. I stepped up to Raymond Chandler, but which is why, I suppose I like them because of the idea of nostalgia from them. But yes, there is that whodunit. It's how to solve the crime. It's trying to think that you're better than the detective in the books. Another question here. How do you choose the titles for your books? I don't really know, actually. I used to. About the first 9 or 10 of my novels were all song titles. I just like the idea that song titles were in the public domain. You could have a resonance by putting a song title onto a novel if you chose the song carefully. If it wasn't Agadoo or something like that. So you would have to be very careful about song titles you chose. Beyond that, I just kind of the novels that I write now, the novels themselves suggest the titles. Or in the case of my last novel, The Sinner, my editor suggests the title because they didn't like the one I came up with, and they actually did come up with a much better title for it. So I was very happy about that. Who's the most overrated crime fiction writer of all time, in your opinion? I'm not going to say that. I'm really not, because there's a lot that I see. I don't have time for writers that I think are overrated. I just don't read them. Doesn't float my boat. Wouldn't read it. Likewise, I wouldn't have time for anybody who says, that would be a guilty pleasure. There's no such thing. You read whatever you read for pleasure. If I want to read really rubbish pulp fiction from the 1930s, I'll read it, because not as a guilty pleasure, but because I genuinely love it. Do you think, Mags is asking this, do you think crime can adapt to step away from violence against women as a trope? I don't know. I know that a lot of people get angry about being violent towards women in novels, but the majority of crime in real life is against women, and that is a fact. And I think a lot of it is in the context of how you write about it and how you explore that. I think Val McDermott said that she tends to think that male writers describe how violence looks, while female writers describe how it feels. And, 9 times out of 10, a male person, never mind a male writer, will not know what it's like to walk the streets and be scared to walk home.